Hello, and today we're going to look at the third novel by Herman Melville, Mardi. So, Mardi was published in 1849, and in some ways is an extension of Taiji and Omu. We seem to follow the same character on the same sort of journey. It even begins the same way, with our character rejecting service on a ship and deserting. We've seen this twice before, and when it shows up in this novel, we're hardly surprised. In fact, we think we're in the same world doing the same kind of thing. I'm sure many of Melville's readers thought that way too when they picked up this novel. Melville's introduction even suggests that he's trying to do something new. He wrote, "Not long ago, having published two narratives of voyages in the Pacific, which, in many quarters, were received with incredulity, the thought occurred to me of indeed writing a romance of Polynesian adventure and publishing it as such, to see whether the fiction might not possibly be received for verity. In some degree, the reverse of my previous experience. This thought was the germ of others which have resulted in Mardi." Now, it's fair to say that this is one of Melville's least favorite works. It's rarely read today. People read Taiji, people read Moby Dick, maybe Redburn, White Jacket. Mardi is the kind of way on the bottom of the list, and for some good reasons. It's very bizarre. It's often very hard to read. There's a host of characters. It's hard to keep track of all of them. It's symbolically very baffling. The language is off at times, and sometimes you don't even know what is going on or what he's doing. Now, while in Moby Dick the symbolism exists alongside a pretty ripping good adventure yarn and a nice story, in Mardi one feels that the symbolism needs to be decoded at every step. He gives us allegories galore, many too obvious to modern readers, but many others that you strain to figure out what he's quite wanting to do. Most of it's set in a completely fantastic world. The beginning's set in a world that we recognize, and then it gets more and more bizarre as the novel goes on. And by the end, you're completely in a dream world. And it's for this reason that I think the novel's kind of fascinating, but it's also very hard to get into, very hard to read, and a bit off-putting to many people. Now, in the Library of America version, the novel covers 600 pages, pretty much half of this volume, which is as long as Taiji and Omu combined. It contains just shy of 200 chapters, and so it's also broken up into a lot of short chapters. Some chapters are 4 or 5 pages, some are just 1 or 2 pages. Characters vanish, never to be heard from again and again, and as the characters go from island to island, they are meeting a lot of different people who are just introduced, they're discussed, and then they move on to another place, and they don't hear from them again. And then there's other characters that are always in the background, and other characters who are apparently there, but then they're off stage for prolonged periods of time. And then some characters are just hardly believable, even for a fantasy. Now, a lot of them are really great. Like we have basically like a Viking sailor pirate type. We have a Polynesian king. We have a pretentious Polynesian historian. In fact, every single island we run into has its own host of bizarre and interesting characters. Now, all the problems in Mardi are there, and they're apparent to anyone who reads the book. But all that said, I rather like Mardi, and I've come back to it a few times in my life. Partially, one reason I like it is for its presumption and its imagination. Whatever else you can say about Mardi, it's a bold novel. It's creative and critical at the same time. It's thematic and symbolic while also often being dreamy, and you get the sense you're kind of in a dream world and a fantasy world. While I can't recommend it that people put this on the top of their reading list, I do think it is a journey to take once in one's life, and I think setting off a few days of your life to just be with Mardi, I think is worth doing. But I don't know if I'd ever come back to it again. I don't know, life's too short, perhaps, to come at it again. I might have to read it for some research purposes, but I don't think I'd read it cover to cover again. You may want to consider this novel with the aid of a study guide, which can help you keep track of names and places and characters and give you a bit of help with the symbolism. And there's a handful of decent Melville study guides that will do that. I forget the name of one, but one does go through all his works, all his characters, and gives chapter-by-chapter summaries of his works. And it's a very useful guide if you're plunging into Melville. So the basic story begins sort of where Omu left off. Our character, who now takes on the name Taji, which is the name of a Polynesian god, he once again is deserting from the ship, and he's doing so with a friend named Jarl, who's that pirate, Scandinavian pirate type. Viking type, I mean. Okay, so this character, Taji, he actually gets that name a little bit later, but we'll just call him Taji throughout the novel. He seems to be the same character as Taipi and Tamu in the other two novels, but Dr. Longghost, who is with Taipi at the end of Omu, doesn't show up in this novel at all. So Taji and his comrade Jarl take a boat out and eventually run into a brig, which they take and sail along with the two surviving members of an annihilated company. And we get the story of how it was destroyed. And the characters are Samoa and his wife, and the wife is kind of a problematic character, and she's killed off pretty early in the story. So it ends up being Jarl, Samoa, and Taji on this small boat because that ship sinks. The survivors run into a priest and his sons carrying an imprisoned woman named Ila, and she's a Polynesian woman with bleached skin like an albino and bleached white hair. She's going to be sacrificed. So Taji kills the priest and saves her, but will then be followed by his three sons throughout the novel. So while this novel is in many ways a novel about searching and discovery, it's also about being chased and followed constantly. And this priest's sons are only one group that's chasing him throughout the novel. The narrator then quickly falls in love with Ila and begins to learn more about her story. She believes her origins are supernatural. They eventually arrive in Mardi, which just means the world in Polynesian, and in the world of the novels is actually a series of islands. So this world of Mardi is completely fantastic. It's made up of dozens and dozens of different islands in the Polynesia. Now, Polynesia was kind of vague enough on European maps that Melville could get away with this. He could pretend he's just describing real islands that exist, but he's just making this up. While Omu and Taipi are set basically in reality, this quickly becomes a fantastic novel in a fantasy world. But because the Polynesia was so unknown, he could kind of paint that hidden space, the terra incognito, as he wished. So at the island of Odo, they meet King Media, and he's going to be a major character for the second two-thirds of the novel. They get a visit from the handmaidens of Queen Hotia, another Polynesian royalty, and she falls in love with him, and she is then going to pursue him throughout the novel. The minute she shows up, though, Ila disappears, and this reveals pretty early on that Ila and Hotia are two sides of love in a way, and he's got to make his choice about which one he's going to embrace. And for the rest of the novel, Taji sets out in search of his lost love, while being pursued by the priest's sons and being pursued by Queen Hotia and her troops, her soldiers. And so it's off to the sea. He's accompanied by his initial comrades, so Samoa and Jarl are with them, although I think they drop off at some point in the story. They stay at certain islands. He's also accompanied by the King Media arrives, a philosopher named Babalanja, a historian named Mohi, and a poet named Yomi, Yoomy. So the plot of the rest of the novel is just their travels through Mardi. They visit various islands, they meet people. These meetings allow Melville to provide allegorical critiques of Melville's own world and Europe at the time. And during the voyage, Ila becomes more and more of an abstract figure, not something really tangible, and we never really see her again after she disappears. It's just something he's questing after. And the novel ends with their arrival at the island of Queen Hotia. There, Taji is nearly seduced by the queen and her worldliness. They never find Ila, and Taji ends the novel continuing his wanderings. Taji, therefore, becomes the ultimate Omu. Omu, the title of the previous novel, actually just means wanderer. He travels the entire world seeking this unreachable ideal. His travels expose him to numerous realms, to kings, to good, to evil, to wisdom, to foolishness, to violence, to peace, slavery, freedom, democracy, and tyranny. It's a novel for the rootless, for the unsettled, for the malcontent. And this is good until we are malcontent we won't have that bravery to recreate for ourselves our worlds. And so it's a very optimistic tale, even though it's a novel of failure. And he never finds his love, and he constantly is met with frustration. But it's a very bold novel because our character never gives up, and he's always eager to recreate ourselves. And we learn there's infinite potentials out there in Mardi. So that's my initial thoughts on this really interesting novel that Melville wrote. In a way, I think it's a shame that more people don't read it, because it seems to offer so much. But then I also understand why people don't want to read it, because it can be so frustrating and tiresome at times and just difficult. And some would say Melville says the same stuff in better ways in other novels. I'm not sure that's the case. Omu is more compact and grounded in telling this story, but this is much more on a philosophical level, and maybe this novel really should be looked at as a work of philosophy in the way one might read Thus Spake Zarathustra. Now, not a whole lot of people that I've come across have said much about that. I've read a bit of Melville scholarship, but one of my favorite works examining Melville is C.L.R. James' book, Mariners, Renegades, and Castaways. And this is a novel. Actually, it was written while C.L.R. James was in immigration jail or something, while he was being kicked out of the country. He was from Jamaica, and he was a radical, a communist, and he, of course, wrote a very famous and influential history of the Haitian Revolution. But he also wrote this book about Melville called Mariners, Renegades, and Castaways. And he talks about here how he believed Melville was writing on the revolutions of 1848. This novel was published 1 year after those events. And he's not the only one to point out this connection, but there seems to be some commentary. In fact, in the book itself, you have the revolutions of 1848 alluded to in a place that's supposed to be a metaphorical or allegorical Europe. And this is what James said. He said, quote, "He was an example for an extreme, in fact, a fanatical Democrat. Some of his views he expressed would change in the next book, but Mardi shows that he already believed that a future of continually expanding democracy was an illusion, for America as for the rest of the world, that he considered politics a game played by politicians." End quote. Now, in a way, maybe Ila then symbolizes this expanding democracy, which can't be achieved and seemingly impossible to achieve, but in the end, quote, to quote Melville, "and thus pursuers in pursuit flew on over an endless sea," end quote. That's how the novel essentially ends. There's a rather interesting division of labor presented in the novel, particularly between the major Polynesian characters, and to what degree we can call them Polynesians is pretty vague. They're culturally, they don't seem very much like Polynesia. They're just kind of nominally Polynesian, I suppose. We're in such a mythical realm here. But we get this division of labor on the ship that's pursuing Ila. We have the musician and the minstrel Yumi. He's very naive and idealistic. We have a historian named Mohi, who's very old-fashioned and rigid, and he only can see things kind of as evidence-based. He's really not a very creative figure because partially he's old and he's kind of stuck in his ways, and all he can do is report stories. So Yumi can only create, and he can't really ground himself in fact, but Mohi can only state the facts. And together, you'd have kind of a nice intellectual, you'd think, but it's divided in two minds. And the philosopher Babbalanja is one of the more developed characters we get in this novel. And he's able to look at every question from multiple sides, but you're never quite sure if he's just philosophizing or what he really means. And he'll debate an issue, and his loyalty to that position is dubious. And sometimes he says things that he contradicts later on in his actions. And you sometimes get the feeling he's just playing with ideas because that's what philosophers do. In fact, much of the novel, especially the second half, Taji is simply an observer of these events and these places and these people, and he says almost nothing for chapter after chapter after chapter. Media actually takes a much more important role as the mediator between these different figures on the boat. Taji just taking a back seat. So as we go through the book, you realize that this is a book about failure. And I think that's one thing that makes it attractive to people. And Melville worried about failure himself all the time. And to some degree, we can say that as a writer, he did fail. Only one of his novels was commercially successful. He gave up essentially after a decade or so of writing. Pretty much all his writing was done between 1845 and the late 1850s. So in about a decade, he gave up, and he spent the last 20 years of his life basically as a customs agent at the ports, as a government bureaucrat. But he was good friends with Nathaniel Hawthorne, much more successful at the time, and he wrote this: "Lord, when shall we be done growing? As long as we have anything more to do, we have done nothing. And now let us add Moby Dick to our blessings and step away from that. Leviathan is not the biggest fish. I have heard of krakens." End quote. And in this letter to Hawthorne, Melville expressed that, this quest of writing is something that one can never do. That even after writing, this great work, there's Moby Dick, and then there's something else to write. Pierre would be next, and venturing off to new things. Leviathan is not the biggest fish, for I have heard of krakens. That's a very actually bold thing for a writer to say. But the fact that Melville sort of had to give up writing, he just still wrote on his side. He wrote Clara, the poem, and Billy Budd was published posthumously, but he never was quite the writer he was during his peak. So in Mardi, Ila represents an unachievable goal that can only be pursued through failure. It's written into the plot that failure is inevitable. She's not discovered after 700 pages, and that's part, I think, of why this novel is great. And it might be part of the reason why people will come away discontent from reading it, is there doesn't seem to be a resolution to the tale. The ideals, whatever they are, whatever Ila represents, must be pursued. To not do so is cowardice, and even if they're never fully achieved, we must pursue them. Better to be a reckless fool like Taji than a content person. And this is partially where the political metaphors of the novel become relevant, because he's always exploring these different political systems and ways of life, and none of them are good enough. None of them are ideal. So he always goes on to another place. In fact, some of his companions do stay behind on these islands, and they disappear from the tale. They vanish. Some of them die, right? For instance, Jarl, the Viking, he deserts from the whaling ship with him in the beginning. He's an old salt, a kind of character that Melville likes to write about. His narrators are often sailors who are inexperienced, but Jarl is the experienced sailor who is in that world as well, and they're contrasted. These are the people who devoted their life to the sea. And he's left behind on the island of Mondolonda, ruled by a man named King Borobola. And this is the island where really you have a lot of luxury and pleasure. And he dies on that island, killed by the priest Alima's sons. None of the people that he meets on the way, Babylanja, Mohi, Yumi, Media, are full, complete pictures that provide what Taji needs. Neither do any of the places provide satisfaction. Often they represent the worst characteristics of man. Some places are tedious, some are full of exploitation, some are just boring, some are religious theocracies. Now, some of the clearer metaphors we have for places come towards the end of the novel. We have a place called Dominora, which is essentially England, and we find it's too busy with conflicts with a place called Viveneza, which is essentially America, and trying to crush its eternal revolts. Even Viveneza, this is a great and expanding republic, it's conflicted with slavery, it's plagued with slavery, and during Taji's visit here, we get a description of the farce of democracy, and we actually get a kind of a window into Melville's view of American democracy, where we have politicians giving long-winded speeches, but not accomplishing anything, very pompous, and then actually through Taji, we get a condemnation of American-style democracy. So it seems to be that's Melville stepping out and giving his statement on democracy. Yeah, but it can be kind of tiresome and predictable, because we just, they're going to leave an island and they're going to go somewhere else. But they're never going to find Ila, and I think I can't stress enough that that's the point of this novel. And it makes it very courageous, I think. Melville might be on a quest as much like the protagonist, and you really get the sense he's making this up as he goes along. And like when he started writing it, it starts out as a very natural, normal sea fiction, all in very realistic. But when you get to the second third of the novel, you find you're in this much more expansive world where all the rules and all the things you expect don't apply anymore. But nevertheless, one thing he is consistent about is he asks us from the very first page until the last that tells us from the very first page to the last that we're on a journey, and that this journey is endless. And that's how the story gives us kind of a nice circle. Now, there is one place they visit, which maybe is the closest we get to a representation of a utopia that might satisfy us, and it might be Melville's attempt at the ideal republic, but even that is not good enough. So one of the most final, and this is really the most tempting stop on Taji's voyage throughout Mardi, is Serenia. It's not America. It's not Vivanessi. That's too flawed. But there's this place, Serenia, and this is a utopia. This is essentially like an anarchist utopia. It tempts Taji, who considers staying there. It tempts Media and Babylanja, who actually stay behind in Serenia. And it tempts the reader as a possible alternative to the seemingly endless quest for Ila. You want the novel to end by that point, too. You're 600 pages in. Serenia is stateless. It has no evil. The closest thing they have to an authority figure is a Jesus-like philosopher of peace and love named Alma. Like many people faced with utopia, our voyagers are skeptical at first, but they're exhausted and they're ready to accept the peace of the area. Babylanja says, "Methinks Serenia is the land of enthusiasts, of which we heard, my lord, where Mardians pretend to the unnatural conjectures of reason with things revealed. Where Alma, they say, is restored to his divine original, where deriding their principles from the same sources whence flows the persecutions of Marama. Men strive to live together in general bonds of peace and charity. Folly, folly!" Media is just as convinced that Serenia is a fool's dream. He says, "Much is said of these people of Serenia, but their social fabric must soon fall to pieces. It's based on the idealist of theories. Thanks for thy courtesy, old man, but we care not to visit thy island." How often have we heard these criticisms of any utopia you might give, whether it's communism or anarchism or, even the welfare state gets condemned as unnatural and foolish and unsustainable and utopian. And this is the challenge we have, to accept this utopia or to reject it. And then there's a third option, which is to try to find something even better or to keep pursuing our ideal. Don't accept the half measures. Because the fact that Taji at the end goes on from Serenia suggests that that's not good enough. There's something actually more ideal than even this place Serenia. But there's other people who look at it and don't believe it and disbelieve a utopia when it's right in their face. The first real impression we get of Serenia is its openness and generosity. They're welcomed with song. They learn about Alma, who, as I said, is like a Jesus-like philosopher. He's the only thing they have close to a leader in Serenia. He's known throughout Mardi, but he's often poorly emulated. And you actually have examples of islands that try to emulate Alma and fail to do it adequately. And in fact, there's one whole island that's essentially a criticism of the Catholic Church and religion in general. And you see how Alma's ideas are corrupted. Alma's message is of universal love and brotherhood. He proclaims an afterlife, and he urges his followers to strive for perfection in this world, despite the fact that there's an afterlife. When Media questions Alma's followers on this idea of postponing paradise, he's quickly corrected, saying, quote, "Would that Alma once more descend, brother. We were the turf our everlasting pillow, still would the Master's faith answer a blessed end, making us more truly happy here. That is the first and chief result, for holy here, we must be holy elsewhere. 'Tis Mardi, to which loved Alma gives his laws, nor paradise," end quote. Again, the point being that you got to find our ideal on this world. It's something we have to quest for in this world and not wait to kick off to enjoy. When they explain their social structure, the voyagers learn that Serenia is not like a communist utopia of equality and conditions, but they, quote, "make not the miserable many support the happy few," unquote. So it's a very simple anti-capitalist assumption that you make sure there's not misery. If you widen happiness as much as you can. But bound by Alma's philosophy of brotherhood and love, there's no need for a state. Eventually, the skeptics are converted. Babylanja and Media both are converted. Babylanja mostly through Alma, in Media through, I think, the social structure, because he abandons his title and position as king and becomes a follower of Alma and a resident in Serenia himself. Taji, though, refuses to stay. They say Ila's a phantom, and that they actually suggest Ila is no longer a person but an ideal, and that this ideal can be found on this land. Now, Melville doesn't explain why Taji decides to continue on at the end of the novel. We're not presented with the philosophical arguments against Serenia. Taji never really gives philosophical arguments. That's not his role in the novel. It's enough that Ila is not there that Taji moves on, I suppose. Quote, but it was fixed as fate, is something he says. A few lines later, Taji considers abandoning the quest for Ila and returning to Serenia. But, he says, sweet Ila called me from the sea. Is this an allegory for Christianity? Is it an allegory for the ideal society? Is it an allegory for democracy? I don't know. I mean, it's not really fully given to us, and I don't think it has to be. But the point I want to make, though, is that Serenia, as compelling as it is, and as attractive as it is, some of our great characters of this novel get tied there, it's ultimately another failure. Like Taji, we need to keep searching for this Ila wherever she is. That is Melville's message. Now, I admit there's not much concrete we can use in Mardi. It's, in fact, most of the novel is what we could call critical. It's very much like Gulliver's Travels, I suppose, where you go to different places, and the point of going there is to show, to make a criticism, right? This country's going bad. Europe's bad, England's bad, America's flawed, slavery's bad, Christian Catholic Church is bad, on and on. They go to an island and they reject it. Ila's not here. They go somewhere else. They learn about the society, they critique it, and then Ila's not here, so they move on. What we have here is a fairy tale without an ending. The lessons of the first three Melville novels taken together, and you can watch my videos on Taipei and Omu if you're interested, is that in all of these we find dissatisfaction a common theme. Our character is always on the move, always venturing out somewhere, never content. And in the early novels, it's grounded in the reality of capitalism and exploitation at the sea and the whaling economy. And the characters just want to get away from a ship, or they want to get a new job, right? It's more about something that we all understand is just quitting our job. But in this novel, the same story is told, but it's much more philosophical and much more about the system and the social systems we embrace and the type of world we can have more broadly. So at the end of the day, I definitely want to place Mardi alongside Taipei and Omu as novels about this quest for life, and is resting on a basic rootlessness of the characters. Yet the novel does not really go anywhere, and we end up where we began. So it's really it's the journey that seems to matter, not the destination. But certainly I think there's worse ways to spend our life than questing after something. So I guess that's all I was going to say. I'm at a half an hour. I was going to say a little bit about some of the reviews of this novel. Readers at the time did not get it and did not like it, to say the least. But maybe I'll just read one. This was William A. Jones, the New York, United States Magazine and Democratic Review, July 1849. And he says, "Whoso wishes to read a romance, a novel of the sentimental or satanic school, has no business in Mardi. He need not open the book. But whoso wishes to see the spirit of philosophy and humanity, love and wisdom, showing man to himself as he is, that he may know his evil and folly, may be saved from them, will be reverently thankful for this book." So that's actually a good review. Another quote, this is the Charleston Southern Quarterly Review, and they didn't like how he portrays the South. Quote, "In this voyage, the writer gives a satirical picture of most of the deeds and doings of the more prominent nations, under names which preserve the sound of the real world to our ear, while slightly disguising it to the eye. In this progress, which is a somewhat monotonous one, the author gives us many glowing rhapsodies, much egregrammic thought, and many sweet and attractive fancies, but he spoils everything to the Southern reader when he paints a loathsome picture of Mr. John C. Calhoun in the character of a slave driver, drawing mixed blood and tears from the victim at every stroke of the whip. We make no further comment." Yeah, those Southerners, always so sensitive. Another one, this is George Ripley in the New York Tribune. "We have seldom found our reading faculty so near exhaustion, as our good nature as critics so severely exercised, as in the attempt to get through this new work by the author of the fascinating Taipei and Omu." So there's another bad review that just presents people as baffled. But it seems there was a respect for Taipei and Omu, and readers didn't like that he went off the rails a bit. And Melville heard these reviews and heard this criticism, and actually did go back to more realistic tales in his next two novels, Redburn and White Jacket, which are again based on his actual experiences and are much more rooted in the reality of life at sea. He's going to follow that up with Moby Dick, which attempts to combine, I think, his philosophical power and his big ideas with a more realistic, grounded adventure story. And that's why, you know, it kind of is able to bring these two together. But, you know, I still love Mardi, and I like it's here, and it's something I think I might come back to again. I don't know. I don't know if I'll ever read it cover to cover again, because it does take a long time, and there's plenty of other things to read. But I recommend it's something you explore at some point in your life, just for the experience. So that's my thoughts on Herman Melville's Mardi. Thanks so much for listening. If you have any comments, if you read Mardi, if you're one of the brave few who read this book, please let me know what you thought of it, and what you know, if you have any comments of your own about it. And if you want to hear more of my reviews of American literature, you can follow my channel, and I'll be putting up more content, particularly reviews of the Library of America and reviews of Philip K. Dick. Maybe I'll do some other science fiction, and I'm working on some other projects as well that I'll be uploading soon. So I'll be having a lot of content coming up shortly. So, you know, please subscribe and share this, and you know, enjoy. So again, thank you so much for listening.